A certain very big city in this province often takes up much of the oxygen where it comes to urban planning and how to improve quality of life issues of all kinds. Not tonight. Instead, we are looking at smaller and mid-sized cities to find out how they're building great cityscapes of their own. Here on How They're Doing It, we welcome Jo Fleming. He's the VP for the Council for Canadian Urbanism and an adjunct professor at Western University, formerly the chief planner for the City of London. Mary Lou Tanner, partner and principal planner with the Niagara Planning Group and formerly the chief planner for the Niagara Region. Jason Thorne, general manager of planning and economic development at the City of Hamilton. And Jo Flatt, vice president, corporate strategy and planning at Allied REIT and the former program director at Evergreen, where she led the mid-sized cities program. Good to have all of you on our program tonight. And Jo, I want to start with you. A lot of the cities around Toronto have seen major growth, but it's said that the jobs and the growth are still centered around the 416. Why?
Because growth attracts growth. So once you have that hotbed, the place where people are coming and going to, it just has a perpetual growth and attraction of people and places and businesses from all across the country and from outside the country. So right now, when we have people, 300,000 newcomers coming to Canada every year, a large proportion of those are actually ending up in our gateway cities, one of which is Toronto. So you have more and more people coming into the heartbed and the area of growth in the center.
Having said that, yeah, please.
I'll jump in on that. And just as an example of the challenge that you have in a city like London, looking at that immigration, I was looking at some numbers the other day. Toronto, in around 400,000 immigrants within a 5-year census period. And you can imagine what that does for growth versus about the 5,000 to 6,000 that London had during that same period of time. So when you're looking at some of those drivers of growth, immigration has become so important. Your ability as a mid-sized city to attract immigrants when you don't have maybe that critical mass of those populations with the ethnic kind of norms and communities that immigrants are often looking for, it can be really challenging for those mid-sized cities.
That's what I want to get to. And Jason, maybe you can pick up the story from there because, as you say, growth provokes more growth, but what is the spark that starts the initial growth that then provokes further growth?
Well, I think overall, growth in Toronto is a good thing. It's a good thing for the whole region. It's something we all benefit from. But I think what we're obviously seeing quite a bit of right now is a lot of interest from people who want to live in cities, but for whatever reason, Toronto might not be an option for them. We often hear that in the context of affordability, not just for people looking for homes. We hear that from businesses. We hear that from people who want to open restaurants and open small stores. They too are looking for a place where they can still be in a city, but maybe Toronto's not the city for them. And I think if we look at sort of the catalyst for what has really kicked off growth in Hamilton, a lot of it is that. A lot of it is people who are looking for a real, authentic urban experience, but maybe not in Toronto. And when you look around the region, there actually aren't a lot of places that offer that kind of opportunity, and many have really started to zero in on Hamilton.
And when you say an authentic urban experience, you're differentiating between a suburban or ex-urban experience with a real one. Yeah,
so for those people who aren't going to be satisfied in a bedroom community, in a bedroom suburb, and are looking for the kinds of things that you're used to having in a city. The restaurants, the cultural opportunities, the arts opportunities, diverse opportunities for shopping, all of those types of things. When you're looking for those kinds of urban opportunities, there aren't a lot of places outside of Toronto that offer that to the same extent. And when I talk to people who are making the shift and moving into Hamilton, again, whether it's residential or whether it's businesses, those are the kinds of things that they're looking for.
Mary Lou, I presume, though, that you would like your city, whatever it is, to be, if it's a mid-sized city, you would like it to be a magnet because of intrinsic wonderful qualities that it has, as opposed to, well, I want to live in Toronto, but I can't live in Toronto because it's too expensive and Toronto's too crazy, and therefore I'm going to pick city X, Y, or Z. Fair to say?
That's absolutely fair to say. People really want, as you described it, an authentic experience. They want parks, they want access to the waterfront, they want transit, they want biking, and they want a place to build their business and have a reasonable cost of living. And we're seeing people, Ontario has seen this with people moving to Peel Region and Brampton and Mississauga and the explosive growth there, and now into Hamilton, and we see it in Niagara with people moving their businesses to Niagara because they just have too high a turnover rate in employees because of the cost of housing in the GTA. We see people who are taking more of a risk in moving to beyond Hamilton, but into Waterloo Region, Kitchener, into Niagara, because there are opportunities there that they just can't get in Toronto anymore. Toronto attracting growth is a good thing for Southern Ontario. It truly is, because it brings to this part of Ontario a population that we haven't seen before. It provides an employee base, but it also provides innovation and entrepreneurship that we haven't really seen in decades in this province.
Let me pick up on the employment angle. John, I'll go to you on this. People obviously move all over the place for a variety of reasons, but one of the challenges that they sometimes have is, okay, I can't do Toronto. Let's say I want to do Hamilton or St. Catharines or Niagara Falls. What's that going to mean for my spouse? The opportunity for a spouse to get a job won't be the same in Niagara Falls as it would be in the 416. Fair to say?
Fair to say.
So what do you do about that?
Well, it's not easy, but a couple things. One is I want to talk a little bit about the chicken and the egg, and that is that most people think that, and there's an element of truth, that people go where jobs are, and that is their primary driving force behind where they'll locate. And what Richard Florida, maybe about 10 years ago, started to explore is the magnet that can be created by a community that is a great place to live. And when you look at talent, trying to attract talent, which every city is wanting to do, the idea is to create a great city. So some of those things that Mary Lou was speaking to around a city that has great transit, great cool urban neighborhoods, excellent entertainment, great recreational spaces and trail systems. Those are things that a lot of people are looking for. And if they can find that with a great quality of life, then that's something that might encourage them to go there. And what businesses and investment are looking for is our cities where they know they can attract that labor force. So it's a little bit different than the usual, we create jobs and that'll attract people. It's how can we create a great city that will retain and attract labor force, which in turn will attract that kind of growth that we're looking for.
And I just want to jump in there. Now we have more digital nomads, we have more remote work, more flex work, and you're seeing a lot of mid-sized cities investing in co-working spaces. They have the low-cost commercial space in the downtown. You can sort of turn around and create spaces that entrepreneurs and people with some flex time want to come. And if you have this quality of life, you might have one spouse employed at an institution or at a government, or so they go there for their job, but their partner can negotiate with the Toronto to say, we'll come in 2 days a week, I'll work remotely for 3 days, and we can think about the future of work and how mid-sized cities can be a part of that story in a very different way.
Do you still have to be relatively close to Toronto, though, for that to happen? I mean, you probably can't do that in Chatham, right? Or you probably can't do that in London. You got to be sort of close to Toronto to make that work, don't you?
I think it really depends on the job and how often you might need to go into Toronto. So there's jobs that are entirely remote, and you can work from your living room every single day. And there's jobs that might require that you come into the big city.
And as I was going to say, the digital nomads are making sort of mobility very complicated. And whether it's the fact that they work a bit from home, they work a bit from an office, you have two-income families, you have spouses working in different locations, and you have people turning over jobs every 5, 6, 7 years. They're not staying one place for 30 years working 9 to 5 shifts. And that's where one of the challenges for mid-sized cities, or for any city in the region really, is that connectivity for people is absolutely critical, because people are moving at all hours of the day, all days of the week. A lot of the growth that we're seeing in Hamilton, we're still very far from being a bedroom community. Most of our commuting still happens just within the city of Hamilton, but we're getting people coming who maybe they need to get to Toronto just once a week or just twice a week, and it's not at 9 a.m., it's at noon. So how do you actually accommodate a transportation system that has people moving in all different directions at all different times of day and all different days of the week, and you can no longer predict it? And if you try to predict it, it's probably going to change in 3 or 4 years anyways.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. One of the greatest things any kind of government could do for mid-sized cities, whether it's at a national, provincial level, is to improve that connectivity. And we just need to look at Europe, and we see high-speed rail as a network connecting municipalities of various different sizes. It supports big cities, but it also really provides that opportunity for mid-sized cities to grow as well.
And rural and remote ones too. Connectivity to a large urban core means you can actually stay and work as a farmer or stay in a remote or rural area because you can still access places you need to go.
How close are we to that kind of vision you just put forward?
Well, the high-speed rail conversation continues, we'll say that. I think that at this point, our provincial government isn't too enthusiastic about the idea and moving forward quickly, but I think there's an environmental assessment process that is underway, if I'm correct. But I do think that there's a pressure that maybe people aren't thinking of, and that is the 401 and the congestion that's occurring on the 401, and the need to move goods and services along that corridor at some of the busiest border crossings in North America, being Detroit, Port Huron, and down at Buffalo. And to create capacity, there's a couple different ways we could do it. One is we could expand the width of Highway 401 in that 400 series. And we know what happens when you widen roads.
The traffic will
Reduce more traffic, that's right. Or we could get to something much more sustainable, which is getting those that are commuting, those that are taking discretionary types of trips that don't need to be on the highway, using something like high-speed rail. And let's not just think about it in terms of what the demand is that's there already, but what kind of use could occur if we get that infrastructure in place, and trips between, for example, London and Waterloo. Imagine that labor force London could tap into in terms of the tech sector, and vice versa. And you can have these really complementary flows that aren't possibly occurring now that could occur with that kind of infrastructure.
Mary Lou, let me put this to you. How much of geography is destiny in this case? In other words, a city, if you've got a waterfront, if you're on water, as I'm sure many of the municipalities that you were responsible for were, how much does that influence what you're about to create?
It's a big part of it for sure, and people want cities that are on the water. And the history of this country was built on rail and marine infrastructure and the Great Lakes seaway system. In this part of Ontario, it's actually much more fundamental. It is the rail system. It is GO Transit and the investment there, and using the CP and CN lines, and what that creates in terms of a commuter shed. What we're now seeing, though, in areas along those rail lines is people commuting out to those cities because of 15 and 20-minute service on GO Transit, on the rail line in particular, because you're not in mixed traffic, so there's a greater certainty you're going to get to where you want to go. Because it's 15 or 20-minute service, the schedule becomes irrelevant to you, because you show up and within 15 or 20 minutes, you're on a train and you're on your way. And so we are seeing that in Burlington, we are seeing it in Oakville, seeing it in Mississauga, that people are out commuting from Toronto into those areas for work. What it means is local transit has to get really, really good, because it doesn't do you any good to get to a place like Oakville or Burlington and then you're waiting an hour for a bus or a connection.
So you're saying they should have built the LRT in Hamilton?
Yes, I am, absolutely. But even more importantly, it's investing in that local transit. You know, there's good bus service, and making sure that you have transit leaders who really get that moving people is their number one thing, and figuring out how it fits with how the city's going to grow.
I want to read something from my old hometown newspaper. This is from the Hamilton Spectator. Steve Buist, who was here a couple of weeks ago, and he had this to say about the conversation we're having right now. Sheldon, if you would.
Gentrification is happening in Hamilton. There's no doubt about it. And it's happening, and I think what's causing the friction in Hamilton is that the gentrification is happening geographically in places that have been traditionally affordable places for people to live. And so, you, a Hamiltonian, know that the lower city has these beautiful old Victorian homes. However, some of these Victorian homes may be 2-family homes or 3-family homes, and then all of a sudden they're converted back into being a beautiful 1-family home. And so you have this displacement of people. Rising real estate values, is a double-edged sword. Yep. It's great for those who already have real estate. It's not great for people who want to get real estate.
This is a huge issue, and I want to have some discussion about this right now. Jo, why don't you start us off here? What happens to the communities, to the people who are already there, when a lot of people want to leave Toronto because it's unaffordable and they've decided they want to move into points beyond? What happens to the original folks?
I think it's a great question. I think it's never too early to start planning for housing affordability across the board. So even cities like Sudbury or St. Catharines need to be thinking about housing affordability. We know that when you treat housing like a commodity, we run into issues later on in life. I think when you look at some of the numbers, we're actually seeing some of the downtowns in our mid-sized cities are actually showing far more decline in population than the suburban areas. So we might actually have an interesting sort of dynamic at here where we can think about moving Torontonians into areas like the downtown, not in cases like Hamilton where already there's a huge demand in gentrification, but in these other neighborhoods where they don't have the same population pressures. But overall, I think planning to support the community, talk about gentrification, talk about change, and not put these things underneath a rug that don't get dealt with, because it's going to happen. We know that communities gentrify when more people come there.
Want to weigh in on that, John?
I would. I think affordable housing, just as Jo says, is key. And intensifying is part of that. So in London, there's this major effort through our London plan, our most recent official plan, to grow inward and upward. And what does that do? Well, it creates an opportunity for greater intensity. That tends to bring down the cost of units, and particularly when you're working hard with programs to inject affordable housing. And then to connect that with transportation is key. Because it's not enough to have an affordable unit out in some remote location where somebody's locked to a car and all the expenses that go with it, or taking a bus system that has a very low ridership and is probably very infrequent. It needs to be on reliable, consistent transit, something like a rapid transit line. But I want to point out that these things are expensive. And this is where the challenge is for mid-sized cities. So I look at the capital budget for the City of Toronto, it's about $40 billion over 10 years.
Yeah.
And I look at the same thing for London, and it's like $1.5 to $2 billion. So what's our opportunity to build a rapid transit system relatively quickly? Where's the money for us to invest significantly into affordable housing? Then I look at something like the Places to Grow plan and the Act, and London's not on it. I was astounded back in about 2006 when I showed up at the ministry office and I saw this plan, maybe it was 2004, and these are the places to grow. And then London wasn't even on the map, and there was an arrow to Windsor and Sarnia that way down the 401.
That's a bit weird since the Deputy Premier of the day was from London. How did that happen?
But my point is, I'm going to avoid that question, but my point is that you need to be on the map. As a mid-sized city, there needs to be help for these expensive programs that municipal budgets through tax revenues just cannot afford. And those things are so important to the future of a city and those issues like gentrification.
I should just, for clarification, take that back. I'm not sure she was Deputy Premier just yet. Deb Matthews I'm talking about, but soon to be. Anyway, you wanted to add.
I was going to say, because Steve was obviously talking about Hamilton, and I like his analogy of the double-edged sword, because a city's success can be a double-edged sword. And I watched that episode with a lot of interest. And as someone who grew up in Hamilton in the 80s, to think that someday we'd be having a gentrification discussion and affordability discussion about downtown Hamilton would have been a little surprising. But we are, and it's an important conversation. Because although to folks who are used to the Toronto market may look to Hamilton and say, hey, that's very affordable housing, maybe that's the case on a Toronto salary. But in Hamilton, we actually have one of the biggest gaps in terms of it used to be about the average house price was about 4 times the median income. Now it's upwards of 7 times, which is one of the highest rates in the country. Still not quite where Toronto is. Toronto's up around 8, 9 times the average household income, but that's a significant concern in Hamilton. And I think a key part of responding to that is one is making sure we're bringing on some housing supply in our lower city. And we've been pushing very hard to increase housing supply in the lower city. We offer a number of different grants and incentives and tax deferrals to try to get residential development happening, so we're bringing more product to market. Hamilton City Council put in place a $50 million affordable housing fund. That's a big ticket item for a city the size of Hamilton. But also, Steve made a very good point in his comment about how many of those homes, my own home included, I live in downtown Hamilton, used to house multiple families. It used to be very normal to have a lodger or to have a multi-generational home or to have an income property, an income apartment as part of your home. We've moved away from that, not just in Hamilton, in all the cities in the region. We've moved away from that. And I know in Hamilton and Toronto, I know is doing the same thing. We're trying to get back into that.
Well, it's not crazy that there might be one senior citizen living in some of those beautiful old homes in downtown Hamilton.
Absolutely.
Who are overhoused,
Yeah.
if you want to put it that way,
Yeah, or a couple with no children.
Yeah.
That's very common. So for all the construction we're seeing in Hamilton, all the influx of population in many of our older neighborhoods, population overall is actually still declining because you just have fewer people living in the home. So we've tried to do things like creating permissions for laneway housing, creating permissions to put in basement apartments, those sorts of things, putting in financial incentives for some of those things to happen, to try to actually create as much housing opportunity out of the housing stock that we have. Those are all parts of that responding to affordability and the fears that as new people come, the people who are there now will have to move out. We don't want that to happen.
Let me ask Mary Lou about that, because planners such as yourself love the idea, hope I'm not putting words in your mouth here, but intensification is where it's at nowadays. We don't want further sprawl, and it's so much more difficult to build services ever further away from the main core. But how do you intensify a mid-level city, which maybe people moved to in the first place because they wanted to get away from the intensification of Toronto? How do you get them on side without alienating them?
Well, there's a lot of conversations that need to happen, and a conversation about intensification and growth should be hard. A conversation about expanding your urban boundary into farm should be hard. These should not be easy conversations, and they are fundamentally values-based choices. And if you're not on for expanding into farmland, then that drives different conversations and different choices. It is certainly not easy, but things like Jason talked about, laneway housing, putting an apartment in a house. When I worked in Niagara, we did a very simple thing. We said, if you're a farmer and you want to retire and you want to put an apartment in your farmhouse, go ahead. We're good with that. And
that's against the bylaw now in most rural municipalities in the province.
It really is.
Yeah.
And we said, okay, yeah, we're on for that. And we see it happening. You have to be able to have those difficult conversations. One of the things that we need to talk about is who's going to live there. And sometimes it's scary, those people. Sometimes it's your parents, like the farmer retiring, and it's your kids too. And if you want your kids and your parents to have a reasonable quality of life, either starting or changing their housing, then there needs to be a range of options, and it needs to be on transit lines, because I know my parents in their 70s and 80s didn't drive and should not have been driving. And I know that most of my family members in their 20s want nothing to do with a car. So it is transit and housing together. And when you do that, it's creating affordable options for people that, when you think about it, it really is your family members.
But Jo, I do want to get back to the political issue here, because politicians represent actual people who are already there. They don't yet think of themselves, I'm also representing the potential people who may move in. So the interest of the people who are there, who may not want their neighborhoods intensified, that's going to have primacy in any conversation that Mary Lou wants to have. So how do you make some progress on that?
It's challenging. I think it's really important to look at, there's a direct correlation between a city's openness and their economic growth. So there's communication, there's conversations, difficult, not difficult, that need to be had. The NIMBY movement, the not in my backyard, meeting the YIMBY, the yes in my backyard. So to your point, change is difficult, but it's the only constant. And so unless we choose and decide, and our politicians maybe take a few risks or say some things that they think are in favor of the future of the community, we're not going to be able to address these challenges.
Jason, has there been a culture clash in Hamilton between the people who have lived there for a long time and kind of like the city the way it was, and the city slickers who are coming down the QEW from Toronto, who are expecting, a bit more of that Toronto lifestyle or that Toronto vibe in Hamilton?
I suppose there's been some. I haven't seen it as a significant issue. Maybe it will grow as more of that influx happens. We certainly have a lot of conversations, and we're doing new development in existing neighborhoods and existing urban areas. And for me, part of it, the solution has to be, there's got to be something in it for the people who are living there now as well. So the fact that growth is coming has to have some sort of benefit for the people who are there now. It has to bring in, new parks. It has to create a critical mass of population to support stores and services. There's got to be something for those individuals as well. And if you aren't investing in those types of things, then I think you do have a problem with trying to explain to existing residents, well, why is this good for the city? Why is this good for the neighborhood? If you can't talk about some of those benefits. And you also need to talk about good urban design and architecture. I've seen a lot of infill projects create backlash, not necessarily because people didn't want 6 or 7 units or 10 units or 4 stories in their neighborhood, but because it was ugly. And because it was not a good fit for the lot, because they were trying to squeeze a little too much onto a little too small of a parcel. So sometimes it's pushing back on those sorts of things and saying, if you're going to intensify existing neighborhoods, if you're going to introduce new development and new population, it should add to the beauty of the neighborhood. It should add to the quality of the neighborhood.
Can you tell me this? Hamilton's what, like 500,000-600,000 people right now?
About 530, yes.
530. Does it have aims to be a city of 1 million or 1.5 million people?
So our 2041 population target is about 780,000. So we're getting up into that no longer being able to be on a mid-city panel. I'm going to have to start coming to the big city panel sometime in the next couple of decades. And certainly, the growing pains of that is not lost on the city. The investment that's going to have to be made in transit is a big one, but in our libraries and rec facilities and community services, all of those sorts of things to support a population of almost 800,000 is going to be a game changer for Hamilton.
London is how many people right now?
You could say roughly about 400,000.
Does it want to be double that size someday?
Well, I think the question is to what end?
Because growth provokes more growth.
Is bigger better, and to what degree, and to what size? So when does it become about quality of life? And certainly growth is important, but do you need 5%, 10% growth per year? Does 1%, 2% do it? And that would be heresy for me to say to some people. They would say the more the better, and if you're not talking about rapid growth, then you're talking about decline as a community. Not so. There's something to be said for stable and reasonable growth. There's something to be said for managing congestion. There's something to be said for great quality of life. So I'll give you an example, Steve. A friend of mine recently moved away from London. He lived in Old North, which is a great heritage neighborhood, walking distance to work in the core, all kinds of commercial and restaurant type of amenities. And he could hop onto his bike and get onto the river pathway in a moment's notice. He'd get to work within about 10 to 15 minutes walking. He's moved to North Vancouver. With the money that he was able to secure from the home that he's living in, some sort of comparable debt levels, he is now living in a duplex, which is on half of a lot of a semi, so behind that. And he has 3 children. So I'm not saying that's a negative thing, but it shows you a little bit of the trade-off of being in one type of city versus another. And is bigger always better? I also want to point out that, as you said at the outset, a lot of oxygen is taken up by big cities.
Yeah.
And the 3 big cities in our country, Montreal, big S, Montreal, Vancouver, and Toronto, there's about a third of our Canadian population living in those cities, but there's also about a third of our Canadian population living in mid-sized cities between 50,000 and 1 million people. And so these are important cities, great quality of life, great heritage bones, some highly urban neighborhoods and main streets. And we can't forget that, you don't always need to be thinking about it as bigger is better.
Well, that's interesting. Jo, can you weigh in on this in as much as, in Northern Ontario, the cities are mostly worried about negative population growth. They want to keep what they got. They don't have any pretenses right now about being twice as big as they are right now. They'd love to be able to hang on to what they've got. Do you think cities should be in the business of constantly trying to be bigger, bigger, bigger all the time? Is that where it's at?
Is that where it's at? I don't think that's where it's at. I think it's the attributes of big that should be emulated in the mid and the small. So what is it that people like about big cities? As we were saying, they like that they're transit connected. They like that there's cool retail experiences. They like that they're walkable. They have the mixed use. I think those values are growing increasingly important for baby boomers, for millennials, for really all populations. And so how can we use the great bones of our mid-sized cities, many of which were built before World War II, have these historic downtowns that can be transformed, have the waterfronts, have these other features that people value. And if we respect the strengths of these neighborhoods, so supporting Sudbury to be what Sudbury is, supporting Peterborough to be what Peterborough is really critical, because that authentic urban experience doesn't come from transplanting Toronto's ethos. It comes from saying, what are the strengths of this place, and how can we be ourselves in this environment?
You don't have to have 2 million people there to enjoy some of the attributes of a city of 2 million people.
Definitely not.
Got it. Okay.
But there's also the attributes of not being in a city, getting into nature, getting into farms, going to see local farmers and farmers markets. And there's an inherent interest in a local arts community that grows when you support that kind of economy in your community. And you see that in mid-sized cities. You see it in smaller cities as well, that people really care about the fact that they can get out into nature and hike within 5 or 10 minutes. Or they can get to the farmer's market, or they can get to a farm, or that you have a local arts, thriving, interested, and economically growing community that really drives the economy. In Niagara, 10% of the people work in the arts economy. 10%. Way more than any other industrial base. And And so supporting that kind of growth in the economy is really investing in the quality of life in your city, no matter its size.
I think there's an interesting piece on mid-sized city identity as well. And so think of Kingston, Quebec City, Halifax, Victoria, Hamilton. You know, so many cities have this great flavor and identity and making up the fabric of the nation that we live in as well, these mid-sized cities. And I've had some conversations with Jason about Hamilton and its identity and what happens as Toronto starts to spill over into Hamilton, and how can you as a city retain your identity? Because it's so important, it's something people cherish, and it's part of their life. Who am I? What city do I belong to?
I want to ask you about whether or not Hamilton wants the same kind of housing situation Toronto has in this regard. One of the biggest chunks of home buyers in this city are people who are not buying it to live in it, but are buying it as an investment property. And there are plenty of good and plenty of bad consequences that come with that. Would you like Hamilton to be like that as well?
No, and that is a concern. And frankly, I think some of the population influx we're seeing in Hamilton right now is because people are getting pushed out of Toronto by that very thing. I think that as Jo said, that commodification of housing is a problem in all cities, in all regions. We have started to have a bit of that conversation. We haven't seen that trend pick up really significantly in Hamilton yet. We've started to look at the regulation of Airbnb following Toronto's lead, actually. Not as big of a problem in Hamilton, but we want to get a little out of ahead of it. For me, the benefit of the growth is the people that it brings, the jobs that it can bring, the opportunity that it can bring. Empty investor housing doesn't bring those kinds of opportunities.
It
so
doesn't,
that's a concern.
But you know, because you're in touch with real estate people, that Hamilton is, you know, they think Hamilton is about to be that next domino in this, right? That people are going to want to buy there, not to live there, but because it's an investment property. Are you concerned about that? Concerned
about it, and it's on the radar. If people are buying investment properties and putting them on the rental market, we're seeing a lot of that. I've got no concerns with that. The secondary rental market is growing significantly in Hamilton, which is people who are buying a couple of units and putting them out for rental. I think that's great. I think that's a great way to meet some of the rental demand. Where I'd be concerned if we start to see what I've seen in Toronto, what has been experienced in Vancouver, where you start to have empty housing. That would be a significant concern.
You're not there yet.
We're not there yet, but it is something that we're certainly watching, that trend happening in some of the other bigger cities.
Do you ever think about that for the Niagara region?
Oh, absolutely. We have people contacting us all the time about building rental housing, about investor housing. City of Niagara Falls is dealing with the Airbnb issue.
Niagara on the Lake, I imagine, too. It's got to be big there.
It is. Yeah. And, you know, one of the things that I'm really proud of is we work with a number of developers who are really invested in the community. So we're working with one individual who's building rental housing in Niagara on the Lake, first rental housing projects in Niagara on the Lake in a while, and is going to be working with the Shaw to provide housing for actors and actresses so that they have an affordable, reasonable, clean accommodation. It's time we started thinking differently about housing in this province, because we see the dominoes, as you talked about, and it will spread out. It won't just be Hamilton, Niagara. It will hit Waterloo. It will hit Guelph. It will hit London. And the commodification of housing is a real problem, not just for gentrification and the most vulnerable people, but it's people who want to get their first house, who want to find a quality of home. And so looking at dealing with the most vulnerable and investing in truly affordable housing, and then what do we do about rental? And then what do we do about making home ownership affordable? It's not one size fits all, and we used to think that you would just go up the property ladder, and we need to stop that because it's just contributing to the commodification of housing.
Fair enough, but Jo, how are you going to stop it? I mean, this thing takes on a momentum and a force of its own.
It 100% does. I mean, I think the favoring density and really unlocking everything we can in Toronto, despite our housing crisis, it took us until just a few years ago to unlock laneway housing. So to all the mid-sized cities, it's not about waiting until things are at crisis moments. It's really about being proactive, working with developers. I think we have to see them as partners in legacy building when it comes to our cities to say, how can you create more affordable housing stock? How can we make this neighborhood livable? And really consider all these different factors to what makes a good home and an accessible home.
We've got just a few minutes left here, and I guess I want to hear some ideas from all of you on, you know, if anybody from Queen's Park is watching this right now, John, what do you want to tell them about what kind of policies they should be advancing in order to realize what we've been talking about?
Well, keeping in mind my perspective now is not so much specifically from the City of London, but a broader one. I really do think that we need to think about connecting mid-sized cities, regions with better rail service. And high-speed rail, I think, is an absolute natural. You look at Europe, you look at China, look at many other places across the world. They're connecting their cities with really high-quality transportation, and particularly train services. Second thing I would say is, from an Ontario perspective, make sure mid-sized cities, and even a national perspective, are front and center along with big cities when you're looking at investment strategies. What can be done to support those cities? They're important to our country. It's important we support them. And then some leadership. From the perspective of some of these conversations are tough. Rapid transit is maybe the most difficult. Light rail rapid transit, bus rapid transit in mid-sized cities is extremely divisive. And for the province or the federal government to provide a leadership role in helping these mid-sized cities to navigate through those conversations where the politics are maybe just too hot in the mid-sized cities, for councils to take that whole load themselves, I think that could be really helpful.
Anything you want to add to that list?
I would add two things. So the first thing is dealing with housing affordability, and it means investing in housing and supporting housing organizations to develop. You know, Niagara Regional Housing, $285,000 to build one apartment. No land costs are included in that. That's just the cost of building the unit. So supporting that and investing in that. And I think the other thing, and I heard this from John several years ago, is we truly need to deal with the opioid crisis in cities. It is driving so much of what we see in our streets. When I was in San Francisco last year, I was absolutely staggered at the human cost of opioids. I saw people being treated and brought back from dead. I saw the police take people down with their guns and weapons drawn. And I really worry that if we're not dealing with opioids in this province and in our country, we are going to see things in our cities that are going to just make it staggeringly expensive to deal with the stuff we want to invest in if we're not taking care of our most vulnerable on our streets.
On that rather desperate note, that's our time, I'm afraid. We're going to have to get you two back another time to finish up that conversation. John Fleming from London, Jo Flatt, who's got 3 titles, and I haven't got enough time to go through all of them here. We thank you for being on the left-hand side of the table, and Mary Lou Tanner from the Niagara Region, Jason Thorne from the City of Hamilton. We thank you for being on the right-hand side of the table.
Thank you.
Glad to have you all here tonight.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.